Hi, I'm Ellen Anderson. Today is November 12th, 2021. This is my sixth discussion board post on the process of pulmonary ventilation. Respiration, or breathing, is controlled by the respiratory center in the brainstem in response to CO2 levels. The medulla oblongata sets the basic rhythm of breathing. The medulla oblongata is also known as the pacemaker. The pons smooths out respiratory rate and influences depth and length of respiration. A higher brain center, the cerebrum, allows voluntary altering of breathing, but these capabilities are limited. One can choose to hold their breath for a period of time, but eventually the respiratory center will take over as the CO2 levels increase. Chemicals, carbon dioxide, hydrogen ions, and oxygen levels are the most important factors that regulate respiration. Chemoreceptors are sensory receptors that detect CO2, hydrogen, and O2 levels in the blood. Located in the respiratory center, the carotid arteries, and aorta. CO2 levels are the main influence, as oxygen levels only affect breathing when dangerously low. If CO2 levels increase, the respiratory center, medulla and pons, is stimulated to increase the rate and depth of breathing. This increases the rate of CO2 removal and returns concentrations to normal resting levels. Pulmonary ventilation, or the ability to breathe, to have air enter the lungs during inspiration and air leave the lungs during expiration, is dependent on the differences in pressure between the atmosphere and the lungs. In a gas, pressure is a force created by the movement of gas molecules that are confined. For example, a certain number of gas molecules in a 2-liter container have more room than the same number of gas molecules in a 1-liter container. Therefore, the pressure is lower in the 2-liter container and higher in the 1-liter container. At a constant temperature, changing the volume occupied by the gas changes the pressure, as does changing the number of gas molecules. If volume increases, pressure decreases. Likewise, if volume decreases, pressure increases. Pressure and volume are inversely related. Inspiration, or inhalation, and expiration, or exhalation, are dependent on 3 types of pressure: atmospheric, interalveolar, and interpleural. Atmospheric pressure is the amount of force that is exerted by gases in the air, which consists of nitrogen 78%, oxygen 21%, and carbon dioxide 1%, as well as trace elements and water vapor surrounding any given surface, such as the body. Atmospheric pressure can be expressed in terms of the unit atmosphere, abbreviated ATM, or in millimeters of mercury, mmHg. 1 ATM is equal to 760 mmHg, which is the atmospheric pressure at sea level. Typically, for respiration, other pressure values are discussed in relation to atmospheric pressure. Therefore, negative pressure is pressure lower than the atmospheric pressure, whereas positive pressure is pressure that is greater than the atmospheric pressure. A pressure that is equal to the atmospheric pressure is expressed as 0. Interalveolar pressure is the pressure of the air within the alveoli, which changes during the different phases of breathing. Because the alveoli are connected to the atmosphere via the tubing of the airways, the interpulmonary pressure of the alveoli always equalizes with the atmospheric pressure. Alveolar pressure changes during the different phases of the cycle. It equals at 760 mmHg, equalizes at 760 mmHg, but does not remain at 760 mmHg. Intrapleural pressure is the pressure of the air within the pleural cavity, between the visceral and parietal pleurae. Similar to intraalveolar pressure, intrapleural pressure also changes during the different phases of breathing. However, due to certain characteristics of the lungs, the intrapleural pressure is always lower than or negative to the intraalveolar pressure, and therefore also to the atmospheric pressure. Although it fluctuates during inspiration and expiration, intrapleural pressure remains approximately -4 mmHg throughout the breathing cycle. The difference in pressure drives pulmonary ventilation because air flows down a pressure gradient. The difference in pressure drives pulmonary ventilation because air flows down a pressure gradient. That is, air flows from an area of higher pressure to an area of lower pressure. Air flows into the lungs largely due to a difference in pressure. Atmospheric pressure is greater than intraalveolar pressure, and intraalveolar pressure is greater than intrapleural pressure. Air flows out of the lungs during expiration based on the same principle. Pressure within the lungs becomes greater than the atmospheric pressure. Pulmonary ventilation comprises two major steps: inspiration and expiration. Inspiration is the process that causes air to enter the lungs, and expiration is the process that causes air to leave the lungs. A respiratory cycle is one sequence of inspiration and expiration. In general, two muscle groups are used during normal inspiration: the diaphragm and the external intercostal muscles. Additional muscles can be used if a bigger breath is required. When the diaphragm contracts, it moves inferiorly toward the abdominal cavity, creating a larger thoracic cavity and more space for the lungs. Contraction of the external intercostal muscles moves the ribs upwards and outwards, causing the rib cage to expand, which increases the volume of the thoracic cavity. Due to the adhesive force of the pleural fluid, the expansion of the thoracic cavity forces the lungs to stretch and expand as well. This increase in volume leads to a decrease in intraalveolar pressure, creating a pressure lower than atmospheric pressure. As a result, a pressure gradient is created that drives air into the lungs. The process of normal expiration is passive, meaning that energy is not required to push air out of the lungs. Instead, the elasticity of the lung tissue causes the lung to recoil as the diaphragm and intercostal muscles relax following inspiration. In turn, the thoracic cavity and lungs decrease in volume, causing an increase in interpulmonary pressure. The interpulmonary pressure rises above atmospheric pressure, creating a pressure gradient that causes air to leave the lungs. There are different types or modes of breathing that require a slightly different process to allow inspiration and expiration. Quiet breathing, also known as eupnea, is a mode of breathing that occurs at rest and does not require the cognitive thought of the individual. During quiet breathing, the diaphragm and external intercostals must contract. A deep breath, called diaphragmatic breathing, requires the diaphragm to contract. As the diaphragm relaxes, air passively leaves the lung. A shallow breath, called costal breathing, requires contraction of the intercostal muscles. As the intercostal muscles relax, air passively leaves the lungs. In contrast, forced breathing, also known as hyperpnea, is a mode of breathing that can occur during exercise or actions that requires the active manipulation of breathing, such as singing. During forced breathing, inspiration and expiration both occur due to muscle contractions. In addition to the contraction of the diaphragm and intercostal muscles, other accessory muscles must also contract. During forced inspiration, muscles of the neck, including the scalenes, contract and lift the thoracic wall, increasing lung volume. During forced expiration, accessory muscles of the abdomen, including the obliques, contract, forcing abdominal organs upward against the diaphragm. This helps push the diaphragm further into the thorax, pushing more air out. In addition, accessory muscles, primarily the internal intercostals, help to compress the ribcage, which also reduces the volume of the thoracic cavity. In summation, inspiration, active. The diaphragm and external intercostal muscles contract. The size of the thoracic cavity increases. The increase in volume of the lungs lowers intra-alveolar pressure. External air is pulled into the lungs. Higher atmospheric pressure pushes air into the lower pressured lungs. Expiration. Passive. The diaphragm and intercostal muscles relax. The size of the thoracic cavity decreases. The decrease in volume of the lungs raises intra-alveolar pressure. Air is forced out. Higher intra-alveolar pressure forces air out of the lower atmospheric pressure. Thank you for listening.